Cane Creek Fury Atahi hunted 19 federal agents who killed his 2-year-old daughter. The most devastating act of vengeance against federal authority in the history of the Cherokee lands, and the most methodical campaign of retribution the Great Smoky Mountains had ever witnessed from a father defending his family's honor. This is the true story of A2High. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Graham County, North Carolina, where the ancient peaks of the Smokies rise in misty splendor and where the remnants of the Cherokee Nation had found refuge after the horrors of the Trail of Tears. This was the Qualla boundary and the lands beyond it, territory that the Eastern Band of Cherokee had held onto through determination and legal maneuvering, when the rest of their nation was marched to Oklahoma in the 1830s. The people who remained here were the descendants of those who had hidden in the mountains rather than submit to removal, who had emerged after the soldiers left to rebuild their lives in the only homeland they had ever known. You see, in these mountains in the 1920s, the Cherokee people lived in a state of uneasy coexistence with the federal government that had tried to destroy them. They maintained their traditions as best they could, spoke their language, practiced their crafts, and tried to survive in a world that had taken nearly everything from them. Many had intermarried with the white settlers who had moved into the region, creating families that blended Cherokee and European heritage in ways that defied simple categorization. The making of whiskey was one of many traditions that had survived, learned from both Cherokee medicine traditions and Scots-Irish neighbors, practiced in the remote hollows where federal authority had difficulty reaching. The conflict between moonshiners and revenue agents affected the Cherokee just as it affected their white neighbors, with the additional complication that federal authority over indigenous peoples was even more absolute and more arbitrary than it was over other citizens. The agents who came to enforce prohibition laws often treated Cherokee moonshiners with particular brutality, viewing them as doubly criminal, as both liquor makers and as members of a race that many still considered savage. The violence that resulted from these encounters left scars that would take generations to heal. The man who would become known throughout the Smokies simply as A2High was born in 1895, in a cabin on the banks of Snowbird Creek that his grandfather had built after the removal crisis had passed. His given name at birth was William Locust, the English name his parents had chosen to help him navigate the white world, but he was always called A2High by his family, a Cherokee name that meant the woods and that reflected the forest that surrounded his birthplace. He was the third of 6 children, born into a family that traced its lineage back to the ancient Cherokee settlements that had existed in these mountains for thousands of years. That's right. A2High had grown up in 2 worlds, learning the Cherokee language and traditions from his grandparents, while attending the government school where English was required and native customs were discouraged. He had absorbed both heritages, understanding that survival required the ability to move between them, that the skills of both cultures would be necessary in the difficult world he would inhabit. He was a large man, standing over 6 feet tall, with the dark hair and high cheekbones of his Cherokee ancestors and the blue eyes of a Scots-Irish great-grandmother who had married into the family 3 generations before. His childhood had been shaped by the stories his grandfather told, tales of the old days before the white men came, of the removal that had torn the nation apart, of the courage of those who had hidden in the mountains rather than submit to the long walk west. These stories were more than entertainment. They were education, teaching young A2High who he was and where he came from, connecting him to ancestors whose spirits still dwelt in these mountains according to Cherokee belief. The hunting skills he learned were passed down through generations, stretching back beyond memory. His grandfather had taught him to move through the forest without sound, to read the signs that animals left, to wait with patience that white men could not comprehend. He learned to track deer and bear and wild turkey, to shoot with a precision that came from endless practice, to kill cleanly so that the animal spirit would not suffer. These skills were sacred, gifts from the Creator that carried responsibilities as well as power. His grandmother taught him the plants, the herbs and roots that Cherokee medicine people had used for healing since the beginning of time. He learned which plants cured fever and which eased pain, which could be eaten and which were poison, the complex knowledge of the forest that his people had accumulated over millennia. This teaching was intertwined with spiritual understanding, the belief that plants had spirits that must be respected, that taking from the forest created obligations that must be honored. His education at the government school had been difficult, marked by the constant pressure to abandon his heritage in favor of assimilation into white culture. The teachers punished students who spoke Cherokee, who practiced traditional customs, who maintained connections to their identity. Atuhai had learned to hide who he was during school hours, to become William Locust when necessary, while remaining Atuhai in his heart. The experience taught him that survival sometimes required deception, that the face shown to the outside world need not reflect what lay within. He emerged from the experience with a deep skepticism of federal authority, an understanding that the government that ran such schools did not have his people's interests at heart. The contradiction between the words the teachers spoke about civilization and progress and the reality of what they were doing to Cherokee children was obvious to anyone willing to see it. Atuhai saw it clearly, and he never forgot. His marriage to a woman named Mary Standing Deer in 1918 had been a union that brought together two prominent Cherokee families, a match that was celebrated throughout the snowbird community. Mary was a traditional woman who maintained the old ways, who spoke Cherokee as her first language, who practiced the crafts and ceremonies that connected her to ancestors stretching back beyond memory. Together they built a life on the land that Atuhai's family had held for generations, raising crops and children and continuing the traditions that had survived despite everything the government had done to destroy them. The whiskey making that Atuhai practiced was learned from both traditions, combining Cherokee knowledge of fermentation and herbal preparation with the Scots-Irish distillation techniques that had been shared between the communities over generations of intermingling. His product was known throughout Graham County as exceptionally smooth, sought after by buyers who appreciated quality and were willing to pay premium prices. The income supplemented what the farm produced, allowing the family to live with modest comfort in a region where poverty was the norm. By 1927, Atuhai was 32 years old, a respected member of the snowbird Cherokee community, known for his skill as a hunter and his integrity in all his dealings. His wife Mary had given him 3 children, a son named Thomas who was 7, a daughter named Sarah who was 4, and a baby girl named Ama, which meant water in Cherokee, who had been born in the spring of 1925 and who was just 2 years old when the tragedy that would define her father's life occurred. Little Ama was the light of Atuhai's existence, a beautiful child with her mother's dark eyes and a laugh that seemed to fill whatever space she occupied. She had been born during a thunderstorm, which the elders said was a sign of power, and she had shown from her earliest days a spirit that suggested she would grow into a remarkable woman. Atuhai adored her beyond words, would spend hours carrying her through the forest, pointing out the plants and animals, teaching her the Cherokee names for things before she was old enough to pronounce them. Now, to understand what happened in the summer of 1927, you need to understand the particular circumstances that had made the Cherokee communities of Graham County targets for federal attention. That's right. A new enforcement campaign had been launched against moonshining in the region, led by a federal agent named Sergeant Harold Vance, who had been sent from Tennessee to demonstrate that the same aggressive methods that had proven effective elsewhere could work in the Cherokee lands as well. Vance was a man who made no secret of his contempt for the Cherokee people, who viewed them as primitives, whose resistance to federal authority was both illegal and racially motivated. He had assembled a team of 19 agents, most of them sharing his attitudes, and had launched a campaign of raids that exceeded anything the region had previously experienced. Stills were destroyed with excessive force, families were terrorized, and the traditional Cherokee respect for elders and women was deliberately violated as a means of demonstrating dominance. The raid on Atuhai's property was planned for a hot August morning, when Vance expected to catch the family off guard. Information about the location of his still had been provided by an informant who had been coerced into cooperation, a distant relative who had faced threats against his own family if he did not comply. The Locusts were marked as targets, their Cherokee heritage making them particularly satisfying prey for agents who viewed their work as a form of racial as well as legal enforcement. and that's when the tragedy began to unfold. You see, the morning of August 23, 1927, had started like any other summer day on Snowbird Creek. Ata High had risen before dawn to check his fishing lines, a task that took him away from the cabin for the hours when the federal agents would arrive. Mary was preparing breakfast, the older children were doing their morning chores, and little Amma was playing on the cabin's porch, building towers with wooden blocks that her father had carved for her and laughing when they fell. The federal agents approached through the forest, using techniques they had learned for surprising moonshiners, moving quietly, communicating through hand signals, surrounding the property before making their presence known. What they did not know, and what would later become a central issue in the investigation that followed, was that they had identified the wrong cabin. The still they were seeking was actually located on a neighboring property, and the Locust family had no active operation at that time, Ata High having temporarily ceased production due to concerns about increased enforcement activity. The first shots came without warning, fired by an agent who claimed later that he had seen movement in the cabin that he interpreted as someone reaching for a weapon. The claim was almost certainly false, would later be contradicted by other evidence, but it provided the legal justification for what followed. The agents opened fire on the cabin, pouring bullets into a structure that contained a mother, 3 children, and no weapons within reach. Mary Locust was wounded in the first volley, a bullet striking her shoulder as she tried to gather her children and move them to safety. Thomas and Sarah, responding to their mother's screamed instructions, fled out the back of the cabin and disappeared into the forest, their survival instincts and their father's training saving their lives. But little Amma, just 2 years old, did not understand what was happening, did not know to run or hide, stood frozen on the porch as the world exploded around her. A bullet struck her in the chest, fired by an agent who either did not see that his target was a toddler or did not care. She fell where she stood, her small body crumpling onto the wooden blocks she had been playing with moments before, her blood pooling on the porch her father had built with his own hands. She died almost instantly, too young to understand why men with guns had come to her home, too innocent to have any concept of the hatred that had killed her. Ata High heard the shots from the creek where he was checking his lines, heard the distinctive sound of gunfire that every hunter recognizes, felt his heart seize with a terror that he had never known before. He ran toward his home, covering ground with a speed born of desperation, arriving just as the agents were entering the cabin they had assaulted. He found Mary wounded but alive, found Thomas and Sarah hiding in the forest where they had fled, found little Amma lying on the porch in a pool of blood that was already attracting flies in the summer heat. He held her body, this child who had been alive and laughing just minutes before, felt the warmth leaving her, understood with a certainty that went beyond rational thought that the world had changed forever. The agents surrounded him, weapons raised, shouting orders that he could not process, treating him as a threat when he was nothing but a father, holding his murdered daughter. They arrested him for resisting federal officers, a charge that was later dropped when it became clear that he had done nothing except grieve. The aftermath of the raid was a travesty of justice that would become infamous throughout the Cherokee community. The agents claimed they had conducted a lawful operation, that the shooting had been justified by resistance that had never actually occurred, that the death of a 2-year-old child was an unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of enforcing federal law. No investigation was conducted, no charges were filed, no agent faced any consequence for killing Amma Locust. The federal government protected its own, closed ranks around the men who had murdered a baby, ensured that the truth would never emerge through official channels. The funeral of Amma Locust was conducted according to traditional Cherokee customs, her small body prepared by the women of the community, her spirit sent to the nightland with the prayers and songs that had accompanied Cherokee souls for generations. The entire Snowbird community attended, hundreds of people gathering to mourn a child whose death had shocked them even more than the many other outrages they had endured from federal authority. Ata High stood at the grave without tears, his face a mask that revealed nothing of the transformation occurring within him. And that night, as he sat alone beside the fresh earth that covered his daughter, Ata High made a vow that would define the rest of his life. He would kill them, Every agent who had participated in the raid, every man who had been present when his daughter died. He would hunt them as his ancestors had hunted, would track them with skills developed over generations, would not rest until every one of them had paid for Amma's death with his own life. 19 agents had come to his home that morning. 19 agents would die before he was finished. And that vow, spoken in the Cherokee language to the spirit of his daughter, would be fulfilled with a precision and determination that would become legendary throughout the Southern Appalachians. The planning process that followed demonstrated the heritage that Atahai carried, the hunting and tracking skills that had been passed down through countless generations of Cherokee men. He did not act in haste, did not rush to vengeance in ways that would have gotten him killed or captured before his work was complete. Instead, he planned with the patience of a hunter who understands that the greatest prey requires the greatest preparation, who knows that success comes not from speed but from thoroughness. The intelligence he gathered over the following months was comprehensive beyond anything the federal investigators would later believe possible. He learned the identities of every agent who had participated in the raid, tracked their movements with skills that combined Cherokee woodcraft with careful observation of the white man's world. He studied their habits, their routines, their vulnerabilities, building a picture of each target that would allow him to strike with precision when the time came. His network of informants extended throughout the Cherokee community and beyond, people who shared his grievance against the federal agents and who were willing to provide information without asking what it would be used for. The Cherokee grapevine carried news that the white authorities never saw, communications that flowed through kinship networks and traditional gatherings, intelligence that Atahai collected and analyzed with the patience that his task required. The weapons he used were those he had always used, the rifles and knives that every Cherokee man owned, tools that served equally for hunting game and for hunting men. He did not need to acquire special equipment, did not need to leave traces that might be followed. Everything he needed was already in his possession, had been part of his life since childhood, was as familiar to him as his own hands. The first killing came in November 1927, 3 months after Amma's death. The target was a young agent named James Porter, who had been among the first to open fire during the raid, and who had bragged afterward about the number of shots he had put into the Cherokee cabin. Porter was hunting deer in the mountains outside Robbinsville when Atahai found him, tracked him through terrain that the agent did not understand, waited for the perfect moment when his target was isolated and vulnerable. Porter's body was found 3 days later, an arrow through his heart, positioned in a way that suggested he had been stalked by someone who moved through the forest like a ghost. The method was deliberate, a message that the agents would understand. The Cherokee were hunting them now, using weapons and techniques that no white man could match. The federal authorities were shocked, had not imagined that the moonshiners they persecuted were capable of such calculated violence. The second killing came 3 weeks later, targeting another agent who had participated in the raid. This man, named Robert Wilkins, was found dead on a mountain trail, his throat cut from behind by someone who had approached without making a sound. The Cherokee method was unmistakable, the skill evident, the message clear. The killings were connected, were deliberate, were the work of someone who intended to continue until his purpose was accomplished. The third and fourth killings came in quick succession in December 1927, demonstrating that Atahai's campaign was accelerating. The victims were both agents from the Vance unit, both killed using traditional Cherokee hunting techniques, both discovered in circumstances that suggested the killer could have struck at any time and had chosen his moments with care. The terror that began to spread through the remaining agents was palpable, discussed in official reports that acknowledged the unit was under systematic attack. That's right. Atahai continued his campaign through the winter and spring of 1928, striking with a regularity that kept his enemies constantly off balance. The fifth agent died in January, found floating in the Nantahala River with a knife wound in his back. He had been camping alone, confident that he was safe in a location miles from any Cherokee settlement. Atahai had tracked him for days, had waited until the perfect moment, had struck with a precision that left no room for error. The sixth was ambushed on a remote road in February, shot from a distance that demonstrated marksmanship, honed over a lifetime of hunting. The agent had been traveling between towns, had stopped to relieve himself, had never seen the Cherokee hunter who watched from the ridge above. The single shot struck him in the heart, killing him before he could understand what had happened. The 7th and 8th died on the same night in March, killed in a coordinated attack that showed the killer could be in two places, almost simultaneously, striking from the shadows and then vanishing without trace. Both agents had been present at the Locust cabin that August morning. Both had been identified through Eta High's careful intelligence gathering. Both had faced consequences that the federal system had refused to impose. The terror that Eta High created spread through the remaining agents like a plague. They could not sleep, could not work, could not think about anything except the Cherokee hunter who was eliminating them one by one. Some requested transfers to other regions, pleading for assignments that would take them far from the mountains where death was hunting them. Others resigned their positions entirely, deciding that no government salary was worth the constant fear that had consumed their lives. The investigation struggled against an enemy it did not understand. Federal investigators were trained to pursue criminals who left evidence, who could be tracked through witnesses and physical traces, who operated according to patterns that could be predicted and exploited. Eta High left nothing, moved through the forest like smoke, seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The skills that his ancestors had developed over millennia made him invisible to those who had not grown up with the same knowledge. Each killing demonstrated Eta High's mastery of skills that his ancestors had developed over millennia. He moved through the forest without leaving tracks, approached his targets without making sounds, struck and disappeared before anyone could respond. The agents he hunted had no framework for understanding what they faced, no training that prepared them for an enemy who used the land itself as a weapon, no experience with the kind of patient, methodical stalking that Cherokee hunters had practiced since before Europeans arrived. The investigation into the killings struggled to gain any traction. Federal investigators recognized the pattern, understood that someone was systematically eliminating agents who had participated in the Locust raid, but they could not identify the killer or predict where he would strike next. The Cherokee community, united in grief and anger over Amma's death, provided no cooperation, maintained a wall of silence that the investigators could not penetrate. The surveillance of Eta High began in April 1928, after investigators finally recognized that the father of the murdered child was the most likely suspect. But watching Eta High proved nearly impossible. He seemed to know when he was being observed, would disappear into the forest for days at a time, would emerge with alibis provided by community members who swore he had been with them when the latest killing occurred. The investigators were outmatched, facing a man whose skills they could not comprehend. The 9th killing came on the first anniversary of Amma's death, August 23, 1928. Eta High had saved this date for a special target, one of the agents who had been closest to the porch where Amma fell, who might have been the one whose bullet actually struck her. The killing was more elaborate than the others, involved a pursuit through the mountains that lasted 3 days, ended with the agent cornered and killed, in a manner that left no doubt about the identity and motivation of his killer. The 10th and 11th killings followed in quick succession, each targeting agents who had been identified as active participants in the raid. The 12th came in October, the 13th in November, the 14th in December. By the end of 1928, 14 of the 19 agents were dead, and the remaining 5 had fled the region, seeking safety in cities where they hoped the Cherokee hunter could not find them. But Eta High found them anyway, tracking them through networks of information that extended far beyond the mountains of Graham County. The Cherokee community stretched across multiple states, connected by kinship ties that the federal authorities did not understand, and Eta High used these connections to follow his targets wherever they went. The 15th agent died in Knoxville, found in an alley with an arrow through his chest. The 16th was killed in Asheville, ambushed in a park where he had gone to escape the fear that had consumed his life. The 17th killing came in March 1929, the 18th in April, leaving only Sergeant Harold Vance himself. Eta High had saved the leader for last, had wanted Vance to experience the terror of watching his men die one by one. had wanted him to understand that the Cherokee he had despised were capable of a vengeance that no federal badge could deflect. Vance had barricaded himself in a federal building in Charlotte, had surrounded himself with guards and protections that he believed would keep him safe. He had requested transfer to another region, had been denied, had been told that the Bureau could not allow him to be driven from his post by what was characterized as mountain criminal activity. He lived in constant fear, saw threats in every shadow, understood that the Cherokee hunter would eventually come for him regardless of what precautions he took. The 19th and final killing came on the second anniversary of Amma's death, August 23, 1929. Tahai reached Vance despite every protection, found a way through security that would have stopped anyone less skilled and less determined, killed the man who had led the raid that murdered his daughter in a manner that left no doubt about the identity and motivation of the killer. What passed between them in those final moments was never recorded. But the evidence suggested that Vance's death had not been quick. He had been made to understand exactly why he was dying, had been forced to acknowledge the child whose death he had caused, had faced a reckoning that the federal justice system had refused to provide. The Cherokee warrior who had hunted him for 2 years ensured that his last moments were filled with the terror he had earned. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the campaign ended. Tahai was arrested 2 weeks after Vance's death, identified by evidence found at the scene that connected him to the killing. The case against him was built on physical evidence, on the pattern that connected all 19 killings, on the obvious motive that Amma's death provided. He did not deny what he had done, seemed almost proud of it, faced his accusers with a dignity that reflected his heritage and his certainty that he had done what justice required. The trial of Tahai, conducted under his legal name, William Locust, became the most sensational criminal proceeding in Western North Carolina history, drawing attention from across the country and from Cherokee communities as far away as Oklahoma. The courtroom was packed every day, with spectators traveling from throughout the region to witness the case. Newspapers sent reporters from as far as Atlanta and Washington, making Tahai's story known to millions who had never heard of the snowbird Cherokee. The scene inside the courtroom was remarkable for its cultural contrasts. The defendant sat quietly, his face revealing nothing of what he felt, his bearing reflecting the dignity that Cherokee tradition demanded in the face of adversity. He wore white man's clothing as required by the court, but his presence carried something that transcended his dress, an authority that came from knowing exactly who he was and why he had done what he had done. The spectators included members of the Cherokee community who had traveled from throughout the region, their presence a silent statement of support that no words could have expressed more eloquently. They filled the galleries whenever space permitted, their numbers demonstrating that Tahai was not alone, that his people stood behind him regardless of what the white man's law might say. The prosecution presented evidence methodically, connecting the defendant to the deaths through physical evidence, witness testimony, and the undeniable pattern that linked all 19 victims to the raid that had killed his daughter. They called forensic experts who analyzed arrows and knife wounds, who traced trajectories and estimated distances, who built a technical case that demonstrated the skill and planning behind each killing. The prosecutor was a federal attorney named Charles Morrison, a man who understood the difficulty of his position. He could not afford to appear sympathetic to a defendant who had killed 19 federal agents, but he also could not ignore the circumstances that had driven Tahai to action. His strategy focused on the legal requirements of the case, on establishing the facts without dwelling on the morality of what the defendant had done or what had been done to him. But the trial became something more than a murder prosecution. The defense, led by a lawyer named Thomas Caldwell, who had volunteered to take the case without fee, used the proceedings to put the federal enforcement system on trial. Caldwell was a remarkable figure, a white lawyer who had grown up near Cherokee communities and who had developed respect for their culture that was unusual for his time. He called witnesses who testified to the circumstances of Amma's death, to the wrongful identification of the Locust cabin, to the shooting of a 2-year-old child who posed no threat to anyone. He presented evidence that the raid had targeted the wrong property, that no still had been present, that the killing was not merely unjustified, but based on a mistake that proper investigation would have prevented. The testimony about Amma's death devastated the courtroom. Witnesses described the toddler playing on the porch, described the shots that came without warning, described Atahai holding his daughter's body, while agents shouted orders he could not hear. Photographs of Amma were entered into evidence, showing a beautiful child with dark eyes and a smile that seemed to illuminate the frame. The contrast between the innocent victim and those who had killed her was stark and unavoidable. The testimony about Cherokee history added context that many in the courtroom had never considered. Witnesses described the trail of tears, the forced removal that had torn the nation apart, the survival of those who had hidden in the mountains rather than submit. They explained that for the Cherokee, federal authority was not abstract but personal, connected to generations of trauma that the government had inflicted. The killing of Amma was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that extended back nearly a century. The jury deliberated for 5 days, the longest deliberation in the history of the federal court. When they finally returned, their verdict reflected the complexity of the case and the sympathy that Atahai's story had generated. Guilty of voluntary manslaughter on 19 counts, with a recommendation for the minimum possible sentence. The verdict was a repudiation of the system that had killed Amma and had protected her killers. It acknowledged that while Atahai had committed terrible acts, the acts committed against him and his family were equally terrible and had received no official censure. The judge, a man named Robert Harrison, who had listened to testimony that had visibly moved him, sentenced Atahai to 19 concurrent terms of 5 years each, with eligibility for parole after 3 years. It was the most lenient sentence the law would allow. Atahai served 4 years at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta before being released on parole in 1933. He was 38 years old, had lost his beloved daughter to federal violence, had spent years hunting down those responsible, had spent additional years in prison for seeking the justice that the legal system had denied. He returned to Graham County, to the Snowbird Creek community where he had been born, to the wife and children who had waited for him throughout his imprisonment. The years following his release were marked by a quiet determination to rebuild the life that had been shattered. Mary had maintained the farm during his absence, had raised Thomas and Sarah with help from the extended family that surrounded them, had kept faith that her husband would return. Their reunion was private, shared only with family and close friends, a moment of healing after years of pain that words could not adequately express. Atahai never remarried the wider world, never sought attention for what he had done, never claimed the status of hero that some in the Cherokee community wanted to assign him. He was a father who had avenged his daughter, nothing more and nothing less. The killing had been necessary, he believed, the only response possible to an injustice that the official system would not address, but it had also cost him years of his life, had separated him from the family he loved, had required him to become something that no man should have to become. The nightmares never fully stopped, the memories of what he had done returning in his sleep with a vividness that time did not diminish. He had killed 19 men, had watched them die, had felt satisfaction in their deaths that troubled him even as he could not regret the actions that had caused it. He had become a killer, had violated teachings that his grandfather had passed down about the sacredness of life, had done what he believed was necessary while knowing that it would mark his spirit forever. His later years were devoted to passing on the traditions that had sustained the Cherokee through centuries of hardship. He taught his grandchildren the hunting skills that had served him, the tracking techniques that had allowed him to pursue his enemies, the patience that had characterized his campaign. He told them stories of the old days, of the ancestors who had survived removal, of the strength that came from knowing who you were and where you came from. He never spoke directly about the campaign that had made him famous, deflecting questions with the suggestion that some things were better left unspoken. But the grandchildren understood, absorbed through family stories and community legend, the knowledge of what their grandfather had done and why he had done it. The story became part of their heritage, a reminder that the Cherokee had never been passive victims, that they had always found ways to resist those who sought to destroy them. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1968, at the age of 73. He had lived to see his grandchildren grow up, had watched the Cherokee Nation begin to recover from the centuries of trauma it had endured, had witnessed changes in federal Indian policy, that suggested the worst might finally be over. He was buried according to traditional Cherokee customs. His body returned to the earth from which his ancestors had believed all life came, his spirit sent to join those who had gone before. The grave where High rests is located in a small cemetery on the banks of Snowbird Creek, near the cabin where he was born and the place where Amma was killed. The stone that marks his resting place bears both his names, William Locust and High, acknowledging the two worlds he had inhabited throughout his life. Nearby stands a smaller stone marking the grave of Amma, the daughter whose death had changed everything, the child whose spirit he had avenged. The aftermath of High's campaign reshaped federal enforcement in Cherokee territory for a generation. The exposure of what had happened during the Locust Raid, which came out in devastating detail during the trial, generated public outrage that could not be ignored. Newspapers that had previously ignored or dismissed the concerns of indigenous peoples now published editorials demanding reform. Politicians who had supported aggressive enforcement policies found themselves facing questions they could not answer. Congressional hearings were held to examine federal Indian policy, with witnesses testifying about abuses that extended far beyond the High case. Other families came forward with stories of similar treatment, of raids that had gone wrong, of violence inflicted on people who posed no threat. The accumulated testimony created a picture of federal enforcement in indigenous communities that troubled even those who had supported aggressive policies. Investigations were launched into enforcement tactics, revealing patterns of abuse that had been hidden from public view. The Vance unit was examined in particular detail, with former agents testifying about the culture their leader had created, the encouragement of violence, the racial attitudes that had colored every interaction with Cherokee people. Several supervisors who had enabled Vance's methods found their careers quietly ended. New guidelines were established for operations in indigenous communities, requiring verification of targets before raids, limiting the use of lethal force in situations involving families, mandating investigation of deaths that occurred during enforcement actions. These reforms were significant, though they came too late for Amma and for the many other victims of federal violence against indigenous peoples. The political consequences extended beyond enforcement policy. The trial had forced the federal government to confront its treatment of indigenous peoples in ways that had not occurred since the removal era, had put a human face on the victims of policies that had been implemented with casual cruelty. The image of little Amma, the 2-year-old killed on her own porch, became a symbol that advocates for native rights would invoke for decades to come. The changes in policy reflected a broader shift in how the federal government approached its relationship with indigenous communities. The recognition that Cherokee people were capable of sustained resistance, that they would not passively accept violence against their families, influenced how enforcement was conducted throughout the region. Agents became more careful, more selective, less likely to treat every Cherokee household as an enemy stronghold. The reforms that followed were significant, though they came too late for Amma and for the many other victims of federal violence against indigenous peoples. Procedures were established requiring verification of targets before raids, limiting the use of lethal force in situations involving families, mandating investigation of deaths that occurred during enforcement actions. The changes did not eliminate all abuses, but they represented a recognition that what had happened to the Locust family was unacceptable. The political consequences extended beyond enforcement policy. The trial had forced the federal government to confront its treatment of indigenous peoples in ways that had not occurred since the removal era, had put a human face on the victims of policies that had been implemented with casual cruelty. The image of little Amma, the 2-year-old killed on her own porch, became a symbol that advocates for native rights would invoke for decades to come. The songs that emerged from the High story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were traditional Cherokee songs, composed in the Cherokee language, performed at gatherings where the story was told to new generations. These songs used traditional melodies that had been passed down for centuries, adapted to tell the story of a warrior who had defended his family against overwhelming odds. The Cherokee songs were sung at stomp dances and at ceremonies, becoming part of the oral tradition that preserved Cherokee history. They described High using language that connected him to warriors of the past, heroes who had defended their people against enemies who sought to destroy them. The song celebrated his skill and his determination, portrayed him as a man whose actions brought honor to his family and his nation. One popular Cherokee song described the death of Amma, using imagery that drew on traditional Cherokee understanding of death and the spirit world. The song imagined Amma's spirit traveling to the Nightland, where Cherokee souls went after death, and described her father's vow to send those who had killed her to face judgment for what they had done. The melody was mournful, carrying the grief that the community felt for a child taken too soon. Another Cherokee song told the story of the hunt itself, describing Atahai moving through the forest like the warriors of old, using skills that the Creator had given to the Cherokee people since the beginning of time. This song was more celebratory, capturing the pride that the community felt in one of their own who had proven that Cherokee men were still capable of defending their families, that the old ways still had power despite everything the government had done to destroy them. English language ballads spread through the broader Appalachian community, carrying Atahai's story to audiences who had never heard of the snowbird Cherokee. These songs emphasized the universal themes of the story: the love of a father for his daughter, the rage that followed her death, the determination to find justice when the legal system failed. They portrayed Atahai as a figure who transcended his Cherokee identity, whose story spoke to anyone who had ever loved a child and feared for her safety. One popular English ballad described the morning of the raid, painting a picture of little Amma playing on the porch, the shots that came without warning, the father who arrived too late to save her. The song captured the horror of that morning, the innocence of the victim, the transformation that occurred when a peaceful man became a hunter of men. The image became powerful, a symbol of what happens when authority kills the innocent and faces no consequences. Another English song told the story of the hunt from the perspective of the agents, describing their growing terror as their colleagues died one by one around them. This song captured the fear that must have consumed men who understood that something was stalking them, that they could not see, could not predict, could not escape. It portrayed their attempts to flee, their efforts to hide, their final understanding that the Cherokee hunter would find them regardless of where they went. Historians who have studied the Atahai case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of indigenous resistance to federal authority, arguing that Atahai's campaign represented a continuation of the struggle that the Cherokee had waged against the United States since the removal era. They note that his methods drew on traditional skills and knowledge, that his success demonstrated the value of heritage that the government had tried to eliminate, that his story became a source of pride for Cherokee people who had been taught to be ashamed of their identity. These scholars have traced the connections between Atahai's campaign and the longer history of Cherokee resistance, from the legal battles that had preceded removal, through the survival of those who hid in the mountains, to the preservation of language and culture. Despite government suppression, the Cherokee had never accepted defeat. Atahai stood in a line of resistors, extending back generations, people who had refused to surrender their identity, regardless of the cost. The analysis of his methods reveals how traditional knowledge served purposes that its originators could never have anticipated. The tracking skills developed for hunting deer became tools for hunting men. The patience cultivated over generations of living close to the land became the foundation for a campaign that lasted 2 years. The understanding of the forest as home, rather than as wilderness to be feared, gave Atahai advantages that his enemies could not match. Others have focused on the broader context of federal Indian policy, seeing in Atahai's story an example of the violence that characterized the government's treatment of indigenous peoples throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The killing of Amma was not an aberration, they argue, but a predictable consequence of a system that viewed native lives as less valuable than white lives, that trained its agents to treat indigenous communities as enemies rather than as citizens deserving protection. The connection between Atahai's case and the broader pattern of federal violence against indigenous peoples has been documented by scholars who have examined similar incidents across the country. The casual brutality that characterized the Vance unit was not unique but was replicated in federal operations from the northwest to the southwest. Wherever indigenous peoples maintained traditions that the government sought to eliminate, still others have examined the case as an example of how the justice system responds to violence that challenges its legitimacy. The jury's verdict, convicting Ata High of manslaughter rather than murder, despite overwhelming evidence of premeditation, represented a rejection of federal authority that extended beyond the specific case. The community had judged that the federal agents deserved what they received, that Ata High's actions, while technically criminal, were morally justified by the circumstances that had produced them. Legal scholars have analyzed the verdict as an example of jury nullification in action, a refusal by ordinary citizens to apply laws that they considered unjust. The evidence against Ata High was overwhelming, the killings clearly premeditated, the legal definition of murder clearly satisfied. Yet the jury chose to convict on lesser charges and to recommend minimum sentences, sending a message that the law's categories did not capture the moral reality of what had occurred. The psychological analysis of Ata High's campaign has also attracted scholarly attention. Researchers have examined how he was able to sustain his determination over 2 years of hunting, how he managed the psychological burden of killing 19 men, how he maintained the mask of normalcy that fooled investigators who watched him. The conclusion that emerges is that his Cherokee heritage provided resources that sustained him, including a worldview that framed his actions as justified and a community that supported him throughout his campaign. You see, what Ata High did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. He killed 19 men. Most of them stalked and killed using techniques that left no opportunity for surrender or defense. The fact that his victims had participated in a raid that killed his daughter does not eliminate the fact that he acted as judge, jury, and executioner, taking lives that were not his to take. Any society that hopes to maintain order must condemn vigilante killing, regardless of the grievances that motivate it. And yet his story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that murder is wrong. He was a father whose 2-year-old daughter had been shot dead by federal agents who faced no accountability for their actions, whose child's murder had been classified as justified despite being based on a mistake, whose grief had no outlet through legitimate channels. The system that should have protected Amma had instead killed her, and the system that should have punished her killers had instead protected them. What options did he have? What would any father do when faced with such loss and such complete absence of justice? His story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The raid on the Locust cabin was legal, conducted by agents operating within the scope of their authority. The killing of Amma was legal, classified as occurring during an enforcement action, protected by the immunity that federal agents enjoyed. But none of it was just. Amma was a 2-year-old child playing with blocks on her family's porch. Her death was not justified by any standard that decent people could accept. Ata High created justice where the law had failed, demonstrated that federal power had limits, and forced changes that might protect other children from similar fates. The specific circumstances that produced the Ata High story, the aggressive enforcement of prohibition in indigenous communities, combined with the racism that characterized federal Indian policy, have not recurred in exactly the same form. But the underlying questions that his story raises, about the limits of government authority over indigenous peoples, about accountability when federal agents kill innocent people, about what citizens can do when the system fails them, remain as relevant today as they were in 1927. The descendants of Ata High still live in those Great Smoky Mountains, carrying the memory of their ancestor and of little Amma through the generations. The Snowbird Cherokee community maintains traditions that connect them to the past, including the stories of those who resisted federal authority when resistance was the only option. Ata High's story is told to each new generation, ensuring that what happened will not be forgotten, even as those who lived it pass away. The family reunions include moments of remembrance, times when the elders gather the children and share the history that connects them to their past. They tell stories of Ata High, of his skill as a hunter, of his love for his family, of what he did after Amma was killed. They tell stories of Amma herself, the child most of them never knew, the little girl whose death changed everything. They ensure that both are remembered, that the tragedy and the response to it remain part of family identity. The traditions that Atuhai practiced continue in modified forms. His descendants still hunt in the mountains, still know the plants and animals that their ancestor knew, still maintain connections to the land that has sustained Cherokee people for millennia. The skills that Atuhai used in his campaign are no longer needed for that purpose, but they remain part of the heritage that is passed from generation to generation. The values that shaped Atuhai's life continue to inform his descendants. The importance of family, the obligation to protect those you love, the willingness to sacrifice for what matters most. These principles have been transmitted across the generations. His descendants may live in a very different world than he did, may face very different challenges, but they carry with them the understanding that some things are worth any price. The mountains of Graham County remain today, much as they were in Atuhai's time, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The cabin where Amma died has long since fallen to ruin, replaced by forest that has reclaimed the land, but those who know the history can find the spot where a 2-year-old girl drew her last breath on an August morning that should have been like any other. The creek still flows past the site, carrying water that has witnessed centuries of Cherokee life downstream toward the Little Tennessee River and eventually to the sea. The Snowbird Cherokee community continues to maintain its traditions, including the stories of those who resisted federal authority when resistance was the only option. The annual gatherings include moments when the elders share the history that connects the present to the past. When young people learn about ancestors like Atuhai, whose courage and determination helped preserve the Cherokee identity against forces that sought to destroy it. The cemetery where Atuhai and Amma rest is maintained by descendants who understand its importance. The stones are simple, weathered by decades of mountain weather, but the names carved into them remain legible. Visitors leave offerings according to Cherokee tradition, acknowledging the spirits of those who rest there, honoring their memory in ways that connect to practices stretching back beyond written history. On the anniversary of Amma's death, family members gather at the graves to remember what was lost. They speak to her spirit in the Cherokee language, telling her about the family she never grew up to know, assuring her that she has not been forgotten. They speak to Atuhai as well, honoring the father who avenged his daughter, acknowledging the sacrifice he made in seeking justice when none was available through official channels. The gravesite has become a place of pilgrimage for Cherokee people from throughout the region, visited by those who want to pay respects to ancestors who demonstrated that the Cherokee spirit could not be broken. They come to draw strength from the story, to remind themselves that their people have survived worse than whatever challenges they currently face, to connect with a heritage that extends back thousands of years. The story of Atuhai endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of love and what love becomes when it is forced to witness the destruction of what it cherishes most. It is the story of heritage and how heritage can provide the skills and strength needed to confront overwhelming odds. It is the story of justice and what justice means when official channels offer no remedy for official crimes. It is finally a story without easy answers, a tale that resists simple judgments and invites reflection on questions that have no comfortable resolution. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Atuhai stood, to see the cemetery where he and Amma rest, to walk the forests where he hunted men who had thought themselves hunters? Would you breathe the mountain air that his ancestors breathed for millennia, feel the presence of history that lingers in certain places, sense the spirits that Cherokee tradition teaches dwell in these ancient woods? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the cemetery is difficult to find without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The drive from Asheville takes several hours, winding through mountains that seem to rise higher with each passing mile. The pavement gives way to gravel in places, and the gravel gives way to dirt roads that require careful navigation. The isolation that once protected the Cherokee from removal now makes their communities difficult to reach for those who wish to pay their respects. But the difficulty of the journey is part of its meaning, a reminder that the people who lived here chose this land precisely because it was hard to reach, because the mountains provided protection that the law would not. The community welcomes visitors who come with respect, who want to learn rather than gawk, who understand that they are entering a place with history, stretching back far beyond the arrival of Europeans. The people who live here are proud of their heritage, proud of the ancestors who survived removal, proud of the tradition of resistance that men like High embodied. They will share their stories if asked politely, will explain the significance of what happened, will help visitors understand the context that makes High's story comprehensible. The cemetery sits on a hillside overlooking Snowbird Creek, surrounded by forest that has witnessed thousands of years of Cherokee life. The stones are simple, marked with both English and Cherokee writing, acknowledging the two worlds that High had inhabited. Visitors leave offerings according to Cherokee tradition, small items that honor the spirits of the dead, acknowledgments of the connection between the living and those who have passed. Standing at those graves, looking out over the mountains that High's ancestors had called home since time beyond memory, one can almost feel the presence of those who have gone before. The spirits dwell in these mountains, Cherokee tradition teaches, watching over the descendants who maintain the old ways. High is among them now, reunited with little Amma, their spirits at peace together at last in a sacred land that has always been their home. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of High and Amma close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. His story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in the Cherokee lands during those terrible years, as long as fathers love their daughters with a ferocity that defies law and government and death itself, as long as systems fail and ordinary people find their own extraordinary ways to respond. He is gone now, dust mingling with the earth his ancestors walked for thousands of years, but what he did echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. The lessons of his story remain relevant even today. Indigenous peoples continue to face challenges from government policies that do not serve their interests. The question of accountability when federal agents harm innocent people remains unresolved. The tension between assimilation and the preservation of traditional identity continues to shape the lives of Cherokee people and other indigenous communities. High's story speaks to all of these ongoing struggles, reminding us that the past is never truly past, that the choices made by our ancestors continue to shape the world we inhabit today. The Cherokee Nation has survived, has grown stronger, has reclaimed much of what was taken during the darkest and most brutal years of federal policy. The language that the government schools tried to eliminate is being taught to new generations. The traditions that were suppressed are being practiced openly. The pride that was attacked is being restored. High would recognize much about the Cherokee community today, would understand that the resistance he embodied has continued in different forms, would know that his beloved daughter's spirit lives on in the people who carry Cherokee blood through their veins. And that, my friend, is the true story of High, who hunted 19 federal agents after they killed his 2-year-old daughter Amma during a wrongful and deadly federal raid on his home by Snowbird Creek, a raid that targeted the wrong cabin and that killed an innocent child who was peacefully playing with wooden blocks on her father's porch on a morning that should have been like any other ordinary peaceful day. A story of love and devastating and irreparable loss, of patience and righteous fury, of heritage that provided the skills and strength needed to seek justice where the law could not and would not provide it. The mountains remember his name and his deeds and his ultimate sacrifice made in the name of paternal love and family honor, and through them, through the songs and stories that continue to be sung and told in both Cherokee and English across these ancient and sacred lands. So do we all, now and forever, as long as memory endures, and people gather to hear tales of courage and justice, and the unbreakable and sacred bond between a loving father and his beloved child.